Hi everybody, and welcome to A Case of the Jills. It's too hot for makeup today, it's too hot for clothing, it's too hot for hair, it's just too hot. So this week on this channel we're talking about using love and self-compassion to get through some of our sticking points when we are on the road to amenorrhea recovery. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, I am going to suggest that you do so now. I'm going to link it actually somewhere up here. So at the end of the last video, we created a challenge for ourselves to do 2 exercises that were going to help us try to cultivate some self-compassion. So how did you do? In the first exercise, where we had to notice when we were saying or thinking critical things about ourselves and then try to change that, I'm actually surprised that I didn't say so many negative things to myself as maybe I thought I would. I am a year into this journey, so I think that a lot of the negative things that I used to say to myself about myself in the past have kind of dissipated at this point. But I did notice something really curious. I wasn't actually saying bad things about myself, but I did notice that I have certain attitudes and concepts of myself that were making me change maybe the way I would approach something in the course of a day. So let me be honest about how this sort of played out for me. You know, I looked in the mirror and I saw like wrinkles. And so, I go ahead and say, oh God, I have to stop squinting when I'm working on my computer. Something like that. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily critical, but it certainly is something that has just become so much a part of my life that I've barely think about it anymore, and I bought like wrinkle cream, etc., to compensate for it. In the second exercise, we were encouraged to think about the things that we want and try not to come at things with a perspective of sort of fear of what we don't want. This was pretty enlightening for me. I don't know about you. It actually forced me to take a look at something that I'm working on right now, which is the new website, and try to understand my motivations for that. Up until this point, I've been putting an inordinate amount of pressure on myself because I'm basically teaching myself how to build a website at the same time as building the website. I keep putting all this pressure on myself. I should be done. This should be finished. I'm not doing it good enough. I don't like what I'm doing. It's probably making me more overwhelmed and unproductive than anything else. So instead, I tried to take a look at my goals for the website and what I hope that it achieves. It encouraged me to recognize my fear about it not being good enough. It also encouraged me to take a look at my strengths and where their limits are and ask for help when I need it. I do consider asking for help to be a great strength because I know that my previous type A personality self would not do this, so this is progress. Interestingly, I also received an email from our MD PhD candidate, and she talked about some of the things that she learned from the last video as well. She said that previously she was drawing motivation from fear. She was more thinking about situations that she didn't want to end up in than situations that she did. But she's still struggling with a couple of concepts. This is a great question. I had some idea about how to answer this, but again, I wanted to go back to the experts. This requires us to take a look at that issue that we talked about in the last video, which is self-compassion versus self-esteem. Remember that we talked about self-esteem being sort of conditional based on exactly what's happening in the moment, and therefore sometimes flimsy. Self-compassion, in contrast, is something more unconditional because it has to do with recognizing your intrinsic value that has nothing to do with what exactly is happening in that moment. So there's this amazing article written on self-compassion by Fabio Zucchelli, and I will definitely link it below. I highly encourage you to read it. It's an article written from a sports psychology perspective, and it compares and contrasts self-esteem versus self-compassion with regard to sport performance. He definitely acknowledges that self-esteem is something that gets a boost from our athletic performance or even regular participation in exercise. But since participation and also performance can vary, so does self-esteem. He mentions that self-compassion is more foundational and again unconditional because it provides an underlying basis for something that has to do with you irrespective of anything that's going on around you. He mentioned a study that was done on young female athletes. Those female athletes that were shown to lack self-compassion had a greater fear of failure and a greater fear of self-evaluation. So what we're saying here is that developing self-compassion is literally developing armor against that fear of judgment. He also addressed the great divide between self-criticism and self-compassion. Athletes traditionally say things like, oh, I'm my own worst critic, and we value that. We really highly value that sense of perfectionism. We think it's a good quality to have, despite the fact that perfectionism is actually associated with a whole bunch of negative things, like high stress, heart disease, IBS and Crohn's disease, eating disorders, compulsive exercise, and oh yeah, hypothalamic amenorrhea. So to develop that sense of self-compassion, We have to come at things with a sense of inner abundance. Remember, we talked about this idea at the beginning of the week. The sense of inner abundance means that you can approach circumstances knowing that you are enough on the inside. It's something beyond our physical self. It invites us to orient our thoughts toward like the bigger picture. Who are we? What do we have to offer? What is our greater purpose? I guarantee that it is not to have six-pack abs or beat all the course records on Strava this week. So now we go back to self-compassion and self-love as the thing to develop if you want to see yourself as strong. That kindness that we develop toward ourselves increases resilience and self-worth. It aids in stress reduction. It allows you to appreciate all of your skills, passions, and abilities. It's not contingent on any one thing. It's everything about you. So, Miss MD, PhD, this is how you change the world. You develop that self-compassion and self-love, and now you have the audacity to overcome scrutiny. Do you think Marie Curie put herself down? Rosalind Franklin? Barbara McClintock? I'm telling you that the world needs you to love yourself enough that you go out there and you kill it in the scientific community and become a leader and go win a Nobel Prize. We have enough women out here doubting ourselves, so please go be a badass for us. So let's go back to her original question, where she asks, how do you disregard someone's negative judgments of you? In light of this video, if you're coming to the situation with a sense of inner abundance, you know your strengths, you know that inside you are enough, you have left behind the ideas of perfectionism, and you're acting from a sense of kindness to yourself, it doesn't really matter what anyone thinks. Also, because we are not only trying to be compassionate with ourselves, we're trying to be compassionate with others. It's important to recognize that when you are criticized, it typically tells you a lot more about the person criticizing you than it tells you about yourself. Let's not fault them for that and understand that they are on their journey just as much as we are. Listen, I'm not an expert on all this stuff, but I am going to leave some resources below if you want to look further into developing self-compassion and self-love and figure out how this is going to set you up to go out there and kick ass. I know that looking into all this stuff is really helping me view myself and the way I react to things in a different way. And I would really, really, really love it if you feel the same way. If this has made you do some thinking, can you please leave a comment below and tell me about it? Again, I don't ask you to leave comments just because I like to see comments. I am truly interested in your feedback. I don't know about you guys, but this has been kind of a nice departure this week. Any opportunity that we get to show ourselves more love, I think, is a good one. So again, thank you, Miss MD, PhD, for your email, and thank you for inspiring this series of videos. I'm sure we'll get back to this topic again too. Hey, I want to thank you so much for subscribing to A Case of the Jills, and also for following me on Instagram at A Case of the Jills. You can head over to Facebook as well and like the page there. I am 2 minutes away from finishing the website, I swear to God. You can see that this has been giving me a little bit of a stress headache the last few days, but it's almost done, and I'm really going to be excited to share it with you. I hope that you have an awesome finish to your week, and I will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.